Hello there, and welcome to Simply About Earth, where wonder finds its way into the quiet spaces and knowledge flows like a gentle river toward rest. Tonight, we'll drift back to one of the most extraordinary chapters in our planet's long story. A chapter written long before humans drew their first breath, long before the first village was built, long before our species existed even as a possibility in the vast web of life. The Jurassic Period. That word probably carries images for you. Towering creatures from films, roars that shake the ground, teeth like daggers gleaming in prehistoric sunlight. But the real story runs so much deeper, richer, and more quietly magical than any movie could capture. Tonight, we'll wander into that world together. No hurrying, no racing toward conclusions. Just letting the ancient earth reveal itself to us the way morning light slowly fills a valley, soft and patient and full of surprises. Before we step into that distant time, let me pause here with you, because these journeys aren't only about worlds that disappeared millions of years ago. They're also about this moment, this breath, this place where you find yourself now. So tell me, quietly, in the privacy of your own thoughts, how does the evening feel around you? Are you somewhere comfortable, with the day's noise finally settling into stillness? Maybe you're already where you go to rest, letting your body remember how to be still. Or perhaps it's not evening at all where you are. Maybe you've carved out this pocket of calm from a busy day, creating a small space where time can slow and your mind can wander. However you've arrived at this moment, you're exactly where you need to be. You've already made room for this gentle exploration, and that's the only invitation the ancient world needs. And if this kind of unhurried discovery brings you peace, if you find comfort in learning that doesn't push or rush or demand, I'd be grateful if you helped others find this same quiet corner. A like, a share, a subscription. These small gestures help create pathways for other wanderers who might be looking for knowledge that feels like a soft place to land. They keep these moments of calm available for anyone who needs the world to slow down, just for a little while. So let's begin our drift into the Jurassic. This wasn't merely a stage where ancient dramas played out. It was a living world that breathed and changed and thrived for almost 60 million years, stretching from about 201 million years ago to about 145 million years ago. Try to hold that span in your imagination. Every human story you've ever heard, every civilization that ever rose and faded, every invention and discovery and work of art, all of it would fit into the smallest fraction of Jurassic time. And yet, if you could somehow step into that ancient world, it wouldn't feel entirely foreign to you. The sun still rose each morning, painting the eastern sky with the same gentle progression of colors you know. It still set each evening, though its path across the sky traced a slightly different arc. The moon still pulled at the oceans, creating tides that rose and fell in familiar rhythms, though they flowed stronger then because the moon hung closer to Earth, larger and brighter in the night sky. Rain still fell from gathering clouds, rivers still carved their patient paths toward the sea, storms still built and broke, and passed on. Life still found ways to grow toward the light, to shelter from the cold, to care for its young. The patterns would feel familiar, even as the details would astound you. The Jurassic sits in the middle of what we call the Mesozoic era. The age of middle life, though that name barely hints at the richness of what was happening. Yes, it was when reptiles reached their most magnificent forms, when dinosaurs ruled land and sea and air, but it was also when flowers were just beginning to whisper their possibility into the world, when mammals, still small and hidden, were quietly perfecting the innovations that would one day reshape everything, when birds were taking their first uncertain flights from branch to branch in ancient forests. It was a time when the very continents were pulling apart, slowly reshaping the geography of the entire world, when volcanoes painted the sky with fire and ash, when the climate was so warm that forests grew where ice sheets exist today. The planet itself was restless, changing, experimenting with new ways of arranging land and sea and life. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Jurassic morning. The first thing that would surround you is warmth. Not just the warmth of a summer day in your world, but something deeper and more enveloping. This was a greenhouse Earth, wrapped in an atmosphere that held heat like a gentle embrace. There were no ice caps gleaming white at the poles, no frozen wastelands stretching beyond the horizon. Even the farthest reaches of north and south were green and growing, temperate and alive. The air itself would feel different against your skin, thicker, more humid, carrying scents you've never breathed. The rich, resinous perfume of vast conifer forests, the green smell of ferns spreading like living carpets across the land, the earthy sweetness of soil that had never known the touch of grass, because grass had not yet been invented by evolution's patient hand. Around you would stretch forests, but not forests as your eyes have learned to see them. These were cathedrals built by conifers with columns that reached higher than any building in your world. Trees so massive that their trunks could hide entire communities of smaller life. Their branches supported canopies that filtered sunlight into a soft green-tinted glow, creating a world within a world beneath their protective embrace. Between these giants, other plants filled every available space with life. Cycads with their thick trunks and crowns of stiff, palm-like fronds, though they were more ancient than any palm. Ferns that grew as tall as small trees, their fronds unrolling in perfect spirals before spreading wide to catch every photon of filtered light. And carpeting the forest floor, more ferns, smaller but no less determined, creating a soft, living blanket that your feet would sink into with each step. But no grass. That simple fact would make the whole world feel different to your eyes. Where today you might see meadows waving in the wind, there were prairies of ferns instead. Where hillsides now wear blankets of green turf, ancient slopes were covered with different plants entirely, creating patterns and textures that exist nowhere in your world. As you stood in that warm green twilight, movement would catch your eye. Not the quick dart of a bird or the scurry of a squirrel, but something larger, more deliberate. A branch bending under weight that had nothing to do with wind. The soft thunder of footsteps so massive, they sent small tremors through the ground beneath your feet. A shadow moving between tree trunks too large to be anything you could imagine. And then, perhaps, a glimpse that would stop your breath entirely. A neck longer than your tallest trees, reaching up to browse on branches that hung impossibly high. A creature so vast that your mind would struggle to comprehend it, moving through the forest with the patient grace of something that had never known fear. A sauropod, one of Earth's gentle giants, going about the quiet business of staying alive in a world built to their magnificent scale. But it wouldn't be only giants sharing this ancient forest with you. Smaller dinosaurs would dart between the fern fronds, some no bigger than chickens, their bright eyes alert for insects and other small prey. Early birds would test uncertain wings among the branches, still more reptile than anything you'd recognize, but carrying in their feathered bodies the future of flight itself. And hidden in the shadows, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look, tiny mammals would be going about their secretive lives, no larger than mice, but already perfecting the innovations, warm blood, fur, complex teeth, that would one day inherit the earth. The sounds of this world would weave around you like music from a dream, the calls of dinosaurs echoing through the forest depths, some so low they were felt more than heard, others sharp and carrying, all of them voices from a choir that has been silent for millions upon millions of years. The rustle of wind through needles and fronds, the buzz of insects that filled every niche, every possibility, every corner of the warm, abundant world. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you might hear something else. The sound of water, rivers running clear and free through landscapes, unmarked by any human touch, seas lapping at shores where no footprint but those of ancient creatures disturbed the sand. This was the world of the Jurassic. Not simple, never simple, but layered with complexity that took millions of years to weave together. Every plant, every creature, every grain of sand was part of an intricate pattern that connected the smallest beetle to the largest sauropod, the deepest ocean to the highest cloud. It was a world in constant, subtle motion, continents drifting apart so slowly that 1,000 lifetimes would pass without noticeable change, yet inexorably reshaping the very foundations of geography. Volcanoes rising and falling, painting new mountains against ancient skies, ocean currents carrying warmth and nutrients in patterns that had never existed before and would never exist again. And through it all, life finding ways to thrive that would stretch your imagination beyond breaking. Creatures that flew without ever being birds, reptiles that swam like dolphins in seas warm as bathwater, plants that built forests without ever growing a single flower, ecosystems balanced on relationships so intricate that each small change rippled outward through webs of connection spanning continents. The Jurassic world was alive in ways that almost defy description, every corner filled with purpose, every niche occupied by something perfectly suited to its place in the great pattern. It was a world that worked, that functioned, that sustained itself for tens of millions of years while experimenting with forms of life so magnificent they seem almost impossible. This is the world we'll explore together, slowly and gently, letting each piece of the story unfold in its own time. We'll walk through forests that stretched higher than cathedrals. We'll wade into seas where dragons were real and ammonites drifted like living jewels through crystal waters. We'll meet the giants and the hidden ones, the hunters and the hunted, the pioneers and the ancient masters of their crafts. And as we wander through these ancient landscapes, we'll remember that this world was not a fantasy or a dream. It was as real as the ground beneath your feet right now. The sun that warmed dinosaur skin is the same sun that warms yours. The rain that fell on Jurassic forests is the same rain that feeds the plants outside your window. The very atoms in your body once danced in the bodies of creatures that walked and swam and flew through that ancient world. You are connected to the Jurassic in ways both profound and simple. The breath you're breathing now connects you to every breath drawn by every creature that ever lived. The water flowing through your body has flowed through Jurassic rivers and ancient seas. You are not separate from that world, you are its continuation, its newest chapter, its latest experiment in the endless creativity of life. So let yourself sink into this story like settling into a comfortable chair. Let the warm air of the Jurassic world surround your thoughts. Let the calls of ancient creatures become a lullaby that carries you deeper into wonder. There's no hurry. No deadline, no test at the end. Just the simple pleasure of letting your mind wander in a world so rich and strange and beautiful that it changes how you see everything that came after. The Jurassic is waiting for you, patient as stone, magnificent as starlight, ready to share its secrets with anyone willing to listen. And you've already taken the first step into that world simply by being here, simply by making space for wonder, simply by letting yourself be curious about the long, long story of which we are all a part. Now let's take another step together, deeper into that warm green world where giants walked and the first birds sang their uncertain songs, where time moved differently and life experimented with possibilities that would shape every world that came after. The climate of the Jurassic world wrapped around everything like a warm embrace that never let go. This wasn't just a matter of warmer summers or milder winters, though both of those were true. It was a completely different way for a planet to organize its energy, its weather patterns, its very relationship with the sun. Imagine a world with no ice caps gleaming white at the poles, no frozen oceans to lock away the planet's water, no glaciers grinding slowly across continents. All that ice that today sits atop Antarctica and Greenland, all those billions of tons of frozen water, existed instead as liquid oceans that covered much more of the Earth's surface than seas do now. This meant that sea level was higher, much higher. Vast areas that are dry land today lay under warm, shallow water that sparkled blue-green under ancient skies. These shallow seas were like nurseries for life, places where sunlight could penetrate all the way to the bottom, where nutrients could circulate freely, where every condition seemed designed to encourage abundance. The atmosphere itself held more moisture, more carbon dioxide, more of everything that creates a greenhouse effect. Picture breathing air that felt thick and rich, almost nutritious somehow, air that carried the promise of rain, even on clear days. The sky might have had a slightly different color, perhaps a deeper blue, perhaps with a haziness that softened the edges of clouds and made sunsets last longer. Without ice caps to create the sharp temperature differences that drive today's weather patterns, storms formed differently, moved differently, brought different kinds of rain and wind. Instead of the harsh transitions between Arctic cold and tropical warmth that create the violent weather of your world, the Jurassic atmosphere moved in gentler rhythms, like breathing that never quite stopped. But gentler doesn't mean weaker. The warm oceans could feed enormous storm systems, hurricanes and typhoons that might dwarf anything in recorded history. These storms brought the rain that kept the world green and growing, that filled the rivers and lakes that supported such abundant life. They were forces of renewal as much as destruction, part of the planet's way of distributing energy and water to every corner of its surface. Seasonal change in this warm world was driven more by rainfall than temperature. Instead of summer and winter, wet seasons and dry seasons marked the passage of time. During the wet periods, which might last for months, rain would fall almost daily. Rivers would swell beyond their banks, creating vast floodplains where nutrients could spread across the landscape. Wetlands would expand into temporary lakes that supported their own brief but intense communities of life. Then, as the atmospheric patterns shifted, the rains would become less frequent, then sporadic, then absent altogether. These dry seasons might last just as long as the wet ones, creating entirely different conditions that life had to navigate. Plants would go dormant or shed their leaves, waiting for the moisture to return. Animals would migrate vast distances, following the green corridors where rain had recently fallen. These cycles created rhythms that shaped every aspect of Jurassic life. The great migrations of herbivorous dinosaurs followed the seasonal rains like ancient caravans following water across desert routes. Predators learned to gather at the water sources where prey animals had to drink during dry seasons. Plants timed their reproduction to match the return of favorable conditions. Even the daily rhythm of weather was different. In a world without ice caps to moderate temperature, the difference between day and night could be more extreme in some places, less extreme in others. But everywhere the basic pattern remained. Sunrise bringing warmth and activity, sunset bringing cooler air and different opportunities for life. The warmth extended all the way to the poles, where forests grew in regions that today know only ice and bitter wind. Imagine Antarctica covered not with glaciers but with trees, supporting herds of herbivores and the predators that hunted them. Picture the Arctic Ocean not as a frozen sea but as a body of liquid water where marine reptiles swam and fed. This global warmth was maintained by several factors working together. The higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere trapped more heat. Ocean currents could carry warm water to higher latitudes without being blocked by ice. The continents were arranged differently, creating different patterns of heat distribution, and perhaps most importantly, there were no ice sheets to reflect sunlight back into space. Instead, dark ocean water and green forests absorbed that energy and used it to support life. Living in such a world would have meant experiencing weather in ways that have no modern parallel. Rain falling warm on your skin, almost like a bath. Humidity so thick you could almost taste it, but not oppressive. Life-giving, nurturing, part of what made such incredible abundance possible. Nights that cooled enough to be comfortable but never cold enough to be dangerous. Dawns that brought mist rising from warm waters, creating landscapes that might look like something from a dream. The very air would have smelled different, richer, more complex, carrying the scents of plants that no longer exist, the moisture of seas that covered areas now dry, the promise of growth and abundance that permeated every breath. It would have been air that invited deep breathing, that seemed to nourish as much as sustain. And everywhere this climate supported life on scales that seem almost impossible today. Forests grew continuously, without the dormant periods that winter imposes on modern trees. Plants could photosynthesize year-round in most areas, creating the enormous productivity needed to support giant herbivores. Wetlands and rivers provided constant supplies of fresh water. Warm seas teemed with life that had never known the stress of freezing temperatures. This was the climate that made the Jurassic world possible, not just the background for life, but an active partner in creating conditions where life could experiment with sizes, shapes, and relationships that pushed the very boundaries of what seemed possible. It was a world where the weather itself seemed designed to encourage abundance, diversity, and the kind of patient experimentation that only comes with millions of years of stability. Understanding this ancient climate helps us see why the Jurassic world could support such magnificent creatures, such complex ecosystems, such intricate webs of relationship. It wasn't just that the animals and plants were different. The very atmosphere that surrounded them, the very weather that shaped their daily lives, was organized according to principles that created abundance rather than scarcity, growth rather than mere survival. As we continue deeper into this world, keep that sense of all-encompassing warmth in your mind. Let it inform how you imagine every scene, every creature, every relationship. This was a world where life never had to pause for winter, where growth was limited more by space than by time, where the very air and water seemed to whisper constant encouragement to everything that lived and breathed and grew. The continents themselves were still remembering how to be separate. For millions of years before the Jurassic began, most of the world's land had been pressed together into a single enormous continent that geologists call Pangaea. Imagine every piece of land you know: North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, Antarctica, all pushed together into one vast landmass surrounded by a single global ocean. But deep beneath the surface, forces were stirring that would pull this supercontinent apart. Heat from the Earth's interior was rising in slow, massive currents that pushed against the solid crust above. Where these currents met the surface, they created stresses that built over millions of years until the rock itself began to crack. These weren't sudden breaks, like snapping a branch. They were gradual separations that took millions of years to accomplish, so slow that thousands of generations of dinosaurs could live and die while a rift widened by just a few miles. But the forces were inexorable, patient, powerful beyond anything on the surface to resist. Picture long valleys opening across ancient landscapes, stretching for hundreds of miles like enormous scars in the Earth's surface. At first, these rifts might be dry, just deep cracks where different types of plants could take root in the sheltered environment. Then, as they widened and deepened, the sea would begin to flow in, creating narrow waterways where none had existed before. Over millions of years, these waterways would widen into seas, then into oceans. The Atlantic Ocean, which today separates Europe and Africa from the Americas, was born during this process. But in the early Jurassic, it was just a narrow seaway, perhaps narrow enough that a pterosaur could fly across it in a single journey. For the life of the time, this slow breakup created both challenges and opportunities. Animals and plants that had been able to spread freely across the connected continents suddenly found themselves facing barriers they couldn't cross. Populations that had been part of single widespread species became isolated on different pieces of the fragmenting continent. This isolation was one of the great drivers of evolution during the Jurassic. Separated populations adapted to their local conditions, developing new characteristics that suited their particular environments. Over time, they became so different that they were no longer the same species. This process of geographic separation and evolutionary change created much of the diversity that made Jurassic life so rich and varied. But the breakup also created new opportunities. New coastlines meant new habitats for marine life to explore. Shallow seas formed in the spaces between separating continents, providing perfect conditions for coral reefs and the countless creatures that lived among them. Islands appeared and disappeared as pieces of continent were temporarily isolated before drifting into new arrangements. The physical process of continental separation was often dramatic. Along the great rift zones where the crust was pulling apart, volcanoes erupted with a frequency and intensity that would dwarf anything in human experience. Not just individual peaks, but entire chains of volcanic mountains pouring out rivers of lava that could cover areas the size of countries. These weren't brief, explosive eruptions like many modern volcanoes. Some continued for hundreds or even thousands of years, building enormous plateaus of solidified lava that still exist today. The gases released by these eruptions, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, water vapor, rose into the atmosphere and helped maintain the warm, humid climate that characterized the Jurassic world. For animals living near these active rifts, volcanic activity was a constant presence in their lives. The ground trembled regularly with earthquakes as the crust adjusted to the stresses of separation. The air often carried the smell of sulfur and other volcanic gases. At night, the glow from distant lava flows would light up the horizon, visible from hundreds of miles away. Yet, life found ways not just to survive but to thrive in these volcanically active regions. Plants were quick to colonize fresh volcanic soils, which were often rich in minerals that supported rapid growth. Animals learned to recognize the warning signs of major eruptions and moved to safer areas. Over time, entire ecosystems developed that were adapted to the cycles of destruction and renewal that volcanic activity brought. The breakup of Pangaea also changed ocean currents in ways that affected the entire planet's climate. When all the continents were connected, water moved around the globe in relatively simple patterns. But as new seaways opened between the separating pieces, these patterns became much more complex. Warm water from equatorial regions could now flow into higher latitudes through passages that hadn't existed before. Cold water from polar areas could reach toward the equator along different routes. These changing current patterns helped distribute heat more evenly around the globe, contributing to the warm, stable climate that made the Jurassic such a favorable time for life. The Tethys Ocean, which formed between the northern and southern parts of the fragmenting supercontinent, became one of the most important bodies of water in Earth's history. This warm, shallow sea stretched from what would eventually become the Atlantic to what would become the Pacific, creating a tropical waterway that connected most of the world's oceans. The Tethys was like a vast nursery for marine life. Its warm waters and abundant nutrients supported coral reefs on a scale that might have been unmatched in Earth's history. Fish, marine reptiles, ammonites, and countless other creatures thrived in its crystal-clear waters. Many of the most spectacular marine fossils from the Jurassic come from rocks that were deposited on the floor of this ancient ocean. As you imagine this great continental breakup, try to picture the immense timescales involved. A human lifetime would pass without any visible change in the positions of the continents. Many generations of dinosaurs would live their entire lives while a new ocean widened by just a few miles. Yet over the vast expanse of Jurassic time, these tiny increments of change accumulated into a complete transformation of the world's geography. The animals and plants of the time had no awareness of the grand drama unfolding beneath their feet. To a sauropod browsing peacefully on tree ferns, the gradual separation of continents was completely irrelevant. To a marine reptile hunting in a shallow lagoon, the slow expansion of ocean basins was invisible. They simply lived their lives within whatever world they found themselves in, adapting to local conditions, caring for their young, following the rhythms of seasons and weather that marked the passage of their days. Yet these geological changes were quietly shaping the future in ways that would influence every lineage of life for millions of years to come. They were creating the geographic framework that would determine where different species could evolve, how they could spread, and what opportunities would be available to them. The legacy of this great breakup is still visible today in the shapes of the continents, the patterns of ocean currents, and the distribution of life around the globe. When you look at a world map and notice how the eastern coast of South America seems to fit perfectly against the western coast of Africa, you're seeing evidence of their ancient connection and gradual separation. When biologists study the relationships between similar species on different continents, they often find patterns that reflect the timing and sequence of continental separation that began in the Jurassic. The breakup of Pangaea created the modern world's geography and set in motion evolutionary processes that continue to this day. Understanding this continental transformation helps us appreciate the dynamic nature of our planet. What seems solid and permanent to human eyes is actually fluid and changeable over the long timescales of geology. The the ground beneath our feet is floating on a layer of hot, flowing rock, and the continents are passengers on enormous plates that move according to currents of heat rising from deep within the earth. For the creatures of the Jurassic, this changing world provided the perfect combination of stability and opportunity. The warm climate remained steady for millions of years, giving life time to develop complex adaptations and relationships. But the slowly changing geography created new environments and challenges that drove evolutionary innovation and diversification. As we continue our exploration of this ancient world, keep in mind this sense of a planet in slow but constant transformation. The Jurassic Earth was not a static stage where life performed its dramas, but a dynamic partner in the dance of evolution, constantly creating new possibilities and new challenges that shaped the course of life itself. The seas that surrounded and increasingly penetrated this changing world were unlike any oceans you could visit today. They were warmer, shallower, and filled with life forms that seemed to come more from dreams than from any real history you might know. Yet they were as real as the water flowing through your own veins, and they supported ecosystems of such richness and complexity that they challenge our ability to imagine them. Picture yourself standing on a Jurassic shoreline where warm water the color of tropical skies laps gently at your feet. This isn't the edge of some distant sea, but water that extends far inland, covering areas that in your time are hills and valleys and dry plains. The sea level was so much higher then, with all that water that now sits frozen at the poles flowing liquid and free. Wade into this ancient ocean, and you enter a world designed for abundance. The water is clear enough that you can see the bottom even far from shore, but what you see there would stop your breath, not sand or simple rock, but underwater cities built by corals and other creatures, rising from the sea floor in fantastic spires and domes and branching towers that stretch toward the surface. These reefs were different from any you might visit today. They were built by corals, yes, but also by sponges and algae and other organisms that work together in ways that no longer exist. The patterns they created, the colors they displayed, the very architecture of their construction followed rules that belonged only to their ancient time. Swimming among these reefs, you would meet the true rulers of Jurassic seas. Not fish, though fish were certainly there in abundance, but reptiles that had learned to make the water their complete and permanent home. Creatures descended from land animals, but so perfectly adapted to marine life that they never needed to return to shore, giving birth to their young in the open ocean and living their entire lives beneath the waves. The most remarkable of these were the ichthyosaurs, and seeing one glide through the water would make you think at first that you were watching a dolphin. The resemblance is extraordinary. The same sleek, streamlined body, the same powerful tail, the same graceful efficiency of movement. But look more closely, and you would see that this is something else entirely, something that evolution created independently to solve the same challenges of life in the sea. The head is longer than any dolphin's, more pointed, filled with sharp teeth designed for catching fish and squid. The eyes are enormous, some larger than dinner plates, evolved for hunting in the depths where sunlight fades to blue twilight. And the flippers, while shaped perfectly for swimming, reveal in their bone structure the ancestry of creatures that once walked on dry land. Some ichthyosaurs were modest in size, no larger than the dolphins they resembled, but others were giants that could rival whales, stretching more than 50 feet from the tip of their pointed snouts to the end of their powerful tails. They moved through Jurassic seas like living torpedoes, hunting with a speed and precision that made them nearly invincible in their liquid realm. These creatures had solved the puzzle of returning to the sea so completely that they never needed to surface except to breathe. They gave birth to live young underwater, nurtured them through their early growth, and taught them the skills needed for life in the three-dimensional world of the open ocean. In many ways, they were more perfectly adapted to marine life than many fish. But speed and power weren't the only paths to success in these ancient waters. The plesiosaurs chose a different strategy entirely, one based on grace rather than force, precision rather than overwhelming strength. These were the underwater dancers, using 4 large flippers to move through the water with a motion that resembled flying more than swimming. The long-necked plesiosaurs were among the most elegant creatures ever to live in any ocean. Their necks could stretch longer than their entire bodies, ending in small heads equipped with sharp teeth and keen eyes. They moved through the water like living question marks, their massive bodies remaining relatively stable while their necks wove through the water with snake-like flexibility. Watching a plesiosaur hunt would have been like witnessing an underwater ballet choreographed by evolution itself. The creature would position its body near a school of fish, remaining almost motionless while its neck coiled in preparation. Then, faster than thought, the head would dart forward, seize its prey, and withdraw, the entire strike taking place in a fraction of a second and leaving barely a ripple to mark what had happened. These long-necked giants shared the seas with their shorter-necked relatives, the pliosaurs, which represented the opposite extreme of marine reptile design. Where the long-necked forms were built for precision and grace, pliosaurs were engines of pure predatory power. They had massive heads, sometimes 15 feet long or more, equipped with jaws that could crush almost anything they encountered. A pliosaur was essentially what you might get if you took the predatory power of the largest crocodiles and redesigned it completely for life in the open ocean. Enormous skull, bone-crushing jaws, streamlined body, and flippers instead of legs. Some reached lengths that would rival sperm whales, making them among the largest predators ever to rule any environment on Earth. These marine giants shared their realm with creatures that were smaller but no less remarkable. The ammonites filled Jurassic seas in numbers that challenge imagination, drifting through the warm waters like living nautiluses in shells that came in every conceivable shape and pattern. Some were coiled in tight, perfect spirals. Others spread out in loose, open curves. Some were smooth as silk. Others covered with ribs and spines and decorative ridges that must have served purposes we can only guess at. The largest ammonites had shells wider than a grown person could span with outstretched arms, but they moved through the water with surprising grace, using jet propulsion to push themselves along while their tentacles searched for prey. When threatened, they could withdraw completely into their shells and seal the opening, becoming living fortresses drifting on the current. But perhaps the most abundant of all were the smaller creatures that formed the foundation of these ancient food webs. Fish swam in schools so vast they could darken the water for miles, some early relatives of modern groups, others belonging to evolutionary experiments that would not survive to reach your world. They provided food for everything above them in the marine hierarchy, but they also lived rich, complex lives of their own, following migration patterns that connected distant parts of the ocean. Sharks, already ancient by Jurassic standards, had been perfecting their design for hundreds of millions of years. These weren't the massive great whites of modern imagination, but smaller, more varied forms, each specialized for particular ways of life in the sea. Some had needle-sharp teeth for grasping slippery prey, others had broad, crushing surfaces for breaking shells and bones. The abundance of life in these ancient seas was supported by conditions that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The warm water and high sea levels created vast areas of shallow seas where sunlight could penetrate all the way to the bottom, supporting rich communities of marine plants and algae that formed the base of complex food webs. Coral reefs spread across these shallows like underwater gardens built not just by the corals themselves but by partnership between many different types of organisms. Sponges, algae, and other creatures contributed to reef construction, creating three-dimensional habitats that supported incredible diversity of life. Fish darted among the coral branches in colors that would have made tropical reefs jealous. Crustaceans scuttled across the bottom while mollusks of every description attached themselves to hard surfaces or burrowed into the soft sediments. The tides in these seas were stronger than any you experience today, driven by the moon's closer position to Earth. Twice each day, enormous areas would be covered and uncovered by the advancing and retreating waters, creating intertidal zones that stretched for miles and supported their own specialized communities of life. These tidal zones were meeting places where marine and terrestrial life interacted in ways that no longer happen. Dinosaurs came to drink at the water's edge, leaving footprints that would fossilize in the hardening mud. Pterosaurs dove for fish in the shallows, their cries joining the calls of marine reptiles surfacing to breathe. Early birds tested their flying skills over the water, perhaps learning some of their first lessons in aerial maneuverability while hunting for small fish and crustaceans. The chemical composition of these ancient seas was different from modern oceans, influenced by the higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the massive volcanic activity that accompanied continental breakup. Yet, despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, marine life flourished on scales that seem almost impossible today. Even the sounds of these seas would have been different from any ocean you might visit. The calls of marine reptiles echoing through the water, the clicking and buzzing of countless invertebrates, the splash of creatures large and small entering and leaving the water, the constant whisper of waves moving across shallows that extended much farther than modern continental shelves. At night, bioluminescent organisms would have turned the water into a living galaxy, with points of light drifting and pulsing throughout the depths. The closer moon would have made tides even more dramatic, and its larger disk would have cast stronger moonbeams through the clear water, creating patterns of light and shadow on the seafloor that changed with each passing wave. The interconnection between these marine environments and the terrestrial world was constant and vital. Rivers carried nutrients from the land into the sea, creating plumes of rich water that supported blooms of plankton and the creatures that fed on them. Storm systems moved moisture from the oceans onto the continents, sustaining the lush forests and fern prairies that covered so much of the world. Volcanic islands rose from the seafloor, creating new land that life could colonize, while coastal erosion returned other areas to the waves. This was a world where the boundary between land and sea was fluid, changing, alive with possibility. And it was in this dynamic interface that some of the most remarkable stories of the Jurassic played out, where creatures tested new ways of living, where evolution experimented with forms that would influence the future of life on Earth. Now let's step back onto the land and walk among the forests that covered so much of the Jurassic world. These weren't forests as your eyes know them, but something altogether different, ancient beyond easy imagining, built according to rules that belonged to a time before flowers existed, before grass covered the ground, before many of the relationships between plants and animals that we take for granted had even been invented. Picture yourself walking into one of these ancient forests, and the first thing you would notice is the scale. These weren't just big trees, they were monuments to life's ability to reach toward the sky. Conifers stretched upward for more than 100 feet, their trunks so massive that it would take a dozen people holding hands to encircle one. Their bark was thick and deeply grooved, protection against fire and insects, and the countless other challenges that a tree must survive to reach such size. The canopy they formed was like a green ceiling far above your head, supported by countless columns of living wood. Sunlight filtered down through multiple layers of branches and needles, creating a soft, dim glow that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. Sometimes shafts of brighter light would penetrate where the canopy was thinner, creating spotlights that illuminated patches of the forest floor like natural theaters. Walking through this ancient twilight, your feet would sink into a carpet unlike anything in your world. Layer upon layer of fallen needles, some brown and dry, others still green and fresh, created a soft, springy surface that retained moisture and muffled sound. The air would smell rich and resinous, filled with the perfume of countless generations of trees growing, living, and dying in this same place. But the conifers were not alone in these forests. Between their massive trunks, other plants filled every available space with life. Cycads grew in groves and clusters, their thick stems topped with crowns of stiff, leathery fronds that caught and held what filtered sunlight reached the forest floor. These plants were ancient even by Jurassic standards, survivors from earlier ages who had learned to thrive in the shade of the giant trees. And everywhere, ferns carpeted the ground in endless variety. Some were tiny, just a few inches high, creating delicate patterns at the base of trees. Others grew as tall as small trees themselves, their fronds spreading wide to capture every photon of light that made it through the canopy. Still others specialized in growing on the trunks and branches of the larger trees, creating hanging gardens of green that added another layer of complexity to the forest structure. In the wettest areas where streams ran through the forest, or where the ground stayed perpetually moist, horsetails grew in dense stands. These strange plants, with their hollow, jointed stems and brush-like tops, could reach heights of 30 feet or more in the warm, humid climate of the Jurassic. They created their own unique environments, like bamboo groves but older, stranger, following patterns of growth that existed nowhere else in time. The diversity of plant life in these forests was extraordinary, but it was a diversity built on themes that are largely gone from the modern world. No flowers brightened the green monotony, no fruits hung from branches to attract animal dispersers, no grasses covered clearings or forest edges. Instead, reproduction happened through spores and primitive seeds, through wind pollination and simple chemical signals that we're only beginning to understand. This created a world that was green in ways your eyes have never seen. Every shade of green you can imagine, and some you probably can't, all blending together in patterns that created their own kind of beauty. The green of new fern fronds uncurling in spirals, the darker green of ancient cycad leaves, thick and waxy, the blue-green of conifer needles, each one a tiny chemical factory converting sunlight into the energy that powered these magnificent ecosystems. But these forests were not empty cathedrals. They were alive with movement, sound, and purpose at every level, from the canopy to the forest floor. In the highest branches, pterosaurs roosted and nested, their leathery wings folded against bodies that bridged the gap between reptiles and the flying creatures that would later rule the skies. Some were small, no bigger than modern sparrows. Others had wingspans that stretched wider than a small aeroplane. On branches closer to the ground, the first birds tested their uncertain skills at flight. These weren't the sleek, efficient flyers you know, but experimental creatures still working out the details of how to move through three-dimensional space on feathered wings. They had teeth in their beaks, claws on their wing fingers, and long bony tails that helped them balance as they hopped and fluttered from branch to branch. And moving through the middle stories of the forest, neither on the ground nor in the highest canopy, were creatures that belonged entirely to their own time. Small dinosaurs that had learned to live in trees, climbing with claws and balancing with tails, feeding on insects and small vertebrates that sheltered among the branches. Gliding reptiles that could spread flaps of skin between their limbs and sail from tree to tree like living kites. But perhaps the most magnificent inhabitants of these forests were the creatures that lived at ground level, moving between the massive tree trunks like living embodiments of the forest's ancient power. Here, herbivorous dinosaurs browsed on ferns and cycads, their movements slow and deliberate, their feeding creating a constant, gentle disturbance that kept the forest floor from becoming too cluttered with undergrowth. Some of these plant-eaters were small, no bigger than large dogs, darting quickly between the ferns and disappearing at the first sign of danger. Others were medium-sized, about the bulk of a horse, methodically working their way through the vegetation, their beaked mouths perfectly designed for cropping tough fronds and stems, and occasionally casting shadows that dwarfed everything else. The long necks of sauropods would appear, reaching up to browse on branches that no other creatures could access. These giants moved through the forest with surprising grace for animals so large, their long tails helping them balance as they stretched their necks to incredible heights. Sometimes you might glimpse just a portion of one, a massive leg stepping carefully between trees, a section of neck disappearing upward into the canopy, a tail swaying past in the distance. They were too large to see all at once in the confines of the forest, but their presence was unmistakable. The predators of these forests were hunters adapted to moving through the complex three-dimensional environment of trunk and branch, fern and cycad. Some were ambush predators that could remain motionless for hours, waiting for unwary herbivores to come within striking distance. Others were pursuit hunters that could navigate the cluttered forest floor at surprising speed, chasing down prey that tried to escape through the undergrowth. The relationships between these creatures were intricate webs of interdependence that had developed over millions of years. The sauropods, by browsing in the canopy, opened up spaces where light could reach the forest floor, encouraging the growth of ferns and other ground-level plants that fed smaller herbivores. The smaller herbivores, by eating these plants, prevented any one species from dominating and maintained the diversity that kept the forest healthy. Predators kept herbivore populations in balance, preventing them from eating the forest into bare ground. Decomposers, insects, fungi, bacteria, broke down fallen trees and dead animals, recycling their nutrients back into the soil where new plants could use them. Pollinators, though primitive by modern standards, helped ensure that plants could reproduce and spread to new areas. Even death was part of this cycle of life. When a giant conifer finally fell either from age, storm, or disease, it created a gap in the canopy that let sunlight flood down to the forest floor. This brief period of intense light would trigger a burst of growth among the shade-tolerant plants that had been waiting their turn. Ferns would spread rapidly across the newly illuminated ground. Young cycads would shoot up toward the light, and eventually new conifer seedlings would take root and begin their own century-long journey toward the canopy. The sounds of these forests would have been like nothing you could hear in any modern woodland. The calls of dinosaurs echoing between the trees, some low and rumbling, others sharp and piercing. The rustle of wind through needles and fronds, creating its own kind of music as air moved through the complex structure of the forest. The buzz and hum of insects going about their endless work of pollination, decomposition, and reproduction. And at night, different sounds would take over. The hooting and calling of nocturnal parasaurs, the rustle of small mammals emerging from their hiding places to hunt in the cooler hours, the splash of streams running through the forest, carrying nutrients and moisture to every part of the ecosystem. Sometimes, if you listened very carefully, you might hear the distant calls of marine reptiles from the warm seas that were never very far away in the Jurassic world. The air in these forests would have been thick with scents that no human nose has ever experienced. The resinous perfume of the conifers, stronger and richer than any modern evergreen. The green, growing smell of ferns and cycads, earthy and vital. The musk of dinosaurs and other animals, marking territories and signaling to mates. The sweet scent of decay as fallen logs and dead vegetation return their substance to the soil. These forests were not pristine wilderness untouched by animal influence. They were shaped, managed, and maintained by the creatures that lived within them. Herds of herbivores created trails that became permanent pathways through the undergrowth. Their feeding habits determined which plants could grow where, creating a mosaic of different vegetation types. Their dung fertilized the soil and helped disperse seeds to new locations. Predators influenced the behavior of herbivores, making them more wary and causing them to move regularly rather than staying in one place too long. This prevented overgrazing and helped maintain the forest's diversity. Even the smallest creatures played important roles: insects that pollinated plants, decomposers that recycled nutrients, seed dispersers that helped plants colonize new areas. The forest was a living system in the truest sense, where every component was connected to every other component through relationships that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. Change any part of the system, and the effects would ripple outward through the entire forest, eventually reaching and affecting every other part. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these Jurassic forests was their stability. The warm, humid climate remained relatively constant for millions of years, allowing these complex relationships to develop and persist. Trees could live for centuries, providing stable habitat for the creatures that depended on them. Evolutionary experiments could run for millions of years, testing new forms and new relationships without the disruption of ice ages or dramatic climate shifts. This stability allowed life to explore possibilities that would be impossible in more changeable environments. Creatures could become highly specialized, perfectly adapted to very specific roles in the forest ecosystem. Plants could develop intricate relationships with particular animals or other plants. The entire system could become more complex, more interconnected, more finely tuned than would be possible in a world where conditions changed rapidly. Yet within this stability, there was constant change and renewal. New species evolved to fill empty niches. Old species went extinct when they could no longer compete effectively. Young forests grew up in areas where older ones had been destroyed by storms or volcanoes. The forest as a whole remained stable, but its components were always in flux, always adapting, always testing new possibilities. As you continue your journey through this ancient world, carry with you this sense of the forest as a living entity, a complex web of relationships that connected every leaf to every root, every predator to every prey, every birth to every death. These forests were not just collections of trees and animals, but integrated systems where the whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. They were the foundation of terrestrial life during the Jurassic, the green engine that powered everything else. Without their enormous productivity, their ability to convert sunlight into the energy that flowed through ecosystem after ecosystem, none of the magnificent creatures we associate with the Jurassic could have existed. And yet, for all their importance, these forests have left only the faintest traces in the modern world. A few living fossils, ginkgos, cycads, some conifers, carry forward genetic memories of those ancient times. Fossil impressions in stone preserve the shapes of leaves and fronds that once danced in Jurassic breezes. Coal deposits tell us of vast forests that lived, died, and were buried, their carbon locked away for hundreds of millions of years. But the forests themselves, the living, breathing, interconnected communities that covered so much of the Jurassic world, exist now only in imagination, in the careful reconstructions of scientists who read the stories written in stone, and in quiet moments like this when we let our minds drift back to a time when the world was younger, warmer, and green in ways that words can barely capture. Now, as we move deeper into our exploration of this ancient world, let's turn our attention to the creatures that made these forests and seas their home, starting with the giants that have captured human imagination like no other prehistoric animals. The sauropods were not just large dinosaurs, they were marvels of biological engineering that pushed the very boundaries of what seemed possible for life on land. Picture the largest animal you've ever seen, an elephant perhaps, or a whale glimpsed from a boat. Now imagine something 5 times larger, 10 times larger, stretching longer than a city bus, and weighing as much as a dozen elephants. These were the sauropods, and they were not just big, they were impossibly, magnificently, almost absurdly huge. Standing in the shadow of a brachiosaurus, you would have to crane your neck back until it hurt just to see where the animal's head was, 40 feet above the ground, peacefully browsing on tree branches that no other creature could reach. Its legs alone were thicker than the largest trees, supporting a body that seemed to defy every rule of physics and engineering that should have limited how large a land animal could grow. But these giants were not clumsy or slow, as movies often portray them. They were graceful in their own massive way, moving through their world with the patient deliberation of creatures that had never known fear. Their long necks swayed like living cranes as they fed, reaching into the canopy to strip needles and branches with teeth designed not for chewing but for gathering, letting their enormous digestive systems do the work of breaking down the tough plant matter. Each step they took sent small tremors through the ground, announcing their presence to every other creature in the forest. But these weren't the thunderous impacts of movie monsters. They were the gentle footfalls of animals that had learned to move carefully through their environment, placing each massive foot with precision to avoid damaging the smaller life around them. Their tails, as long as their necks, served multiple purposes. They provided balance for the enormous weight of the head and neck. They could be used as weapons when threatened, though conflicts were rare for animals so large that few predators would dare challenge them, and they may have served as communication devices, creating sounds that could carry across vast distances to other members of their species. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about sauropods was not their size but their abundance. These weren't rare creatures living solitary lives in isolated corners of the world. They were successful, numerous, and widespread, filling the role that herds of grazing mammals play in modern ecosystems. Their fossilized footprints, preserved in what were once muddy lake shores and riverbanks, show that they traveled in groups, sometimes in herds of dozens or even hundreds of individuals. Imagine such a herd on the move, following seasonal migration routes that might stretch across entire continents. The ground would shake constantly under their combined weight. The sound of their calls would carry for miles, a deep rumbling that was felt as much as heard. Dust clouds would mark their passage across open country, while the trees along their route would be stripped of foliage as high as even the tallest individuals could reach. These migrations would have been among the most spectacular sights in Earth's history, rivaling any wildlife spectacle the modern world has to offer, but they were also essential to the functioning of Jurassic ecosystems. The herds distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created pathways that other animals could use. Their feeding opened up forest canopies and prevented any single type of plant from dominating large areas. The different species of sauropods had evolved different feeding strategies that allowed them to coexist without competing directly for the same food sources. Brachiosaurus, with its long front legs and high-held neck, specialized in browsing the very tops of trees. Diplodocus, with its more horizontal posture, fed at medium heights and could sweep its incredibly long neck across wide areas. Apatodosaurus was built more heavily, with the strength to rear up on its hind legs to reach even higher branches when necessary. This partitioning of feeding zones meant that multiple species of giants could live in the same areas without exhausting the food supply. Each had its own ecological niche, its own set of resources to exploit, its own role to play in the complex web of relationships that made Jurassic ecosystems so productive. The physiology that made such giants possible was as remarkable as their size. Their bones were not just scaled-up versions of smaller animal bones, they were engineering marvels, hollowed out with air spaces that reduced weight while maintaining strength. Their hearts were powerful enough to pump blood up necks that stretched 40 feet or more above the ground. Their digestive systems were enormous factories that could process hundreds of pounds of plant matter every day. Most remarkably, these giants grew from babies no larger than small dogs, the eggs of sauropods, while large by modern standards were still small enough that a human could hold one easily. The baby dinosaurs that hatched from these eggs had to grow approximately 100-fold in mass to reach adult size, a feat of biological growth that has few parallels in the modern world. This rapid growth required enormous amounts of food and ideal environmental conditions. The young sauropods had to avoid predators while growing large enough to be safe, navigate the complex social dynamics of the herd, and find enough nutrition to fuel their incredible development. Many didn't survive this vulnerable period, but those that did became nearly invulnerable to predation. The presence of these giants influenced every other aspect of Jurassic terrestrial ecosystems. Plants evolved to cope with browsing pressure from animals that could strip every leaf within 40 feet of the ground. Predators evolved strategies for hunting creatures too large to kill directly, perhaps working in groups to bring down juveniles or target sick and elderly individuals. Smaller herbivores learned to take advantage of the feeding activities of sauropods, gleaning food from the debris left by their massive cousins. Even the landscape itself was shaped by sauropods. Their well-traveled routes became permanent features, carved deeper by each passing herd. Areas where they congregated became trampled and compacted, creating clearings that supported different plant communities than the surrounding forest. Their wallowing sites where they rolled in mud to rid themselves of parasites became temporary ponds that supported aquatic life. The social behavior of sauropods was probably complex, despite their reputation as simple-minded giants. The evidence of their herding behavior suggests sophisticated communication and coordination. They may have had hierarchies based on age and size. They certainly cared for their young, with adults shielding juveniles from predators and leading them to the best feeding areas. Their calls may have included not just the deep rumbling sounds that could travel long distances, but also higher-pitched vocalizations for close-range communication, visual signals, posturing, neck movements, tail positions, probably played important roles in their social interactions. Chemical communication through scents may have helped them recognize individuals and track the reproductive status of potential mates. Living in a world with sauropods would have meant constantly being aware of their presence. Even when they were not visible, their influence would have been everywhere in the shape of the vegetation, the patterns of trails through the forest, the very organization of the ecosystem itself. They were not just animals living in their environment, but forces that actively shaped and maintained that environment through their presence and behavior. The extinction of sauropods at the end of the Cretaceous period removed one of the most important ecological forces the terrestrial world had ever known. No land animals since have come close to their size or their ecological impact. The forests and grasslands that developed after their disappearance were organized according to very different principles, shaped by smaller herbivores with different feeding strategies and different effects on plant communities. Yet while the giants themselves are gone, their legacy lives on in the modern world in subtle ways. The plants that survived the end Cretaceous extinction included many that had evolved defenses against large herbivores. Some modern ecosystems still show signs of being adapted to browsing pressure from animals much larger than any that exist today. And in the DNA of modern birds, genetic echoes of the sauropods persist. Reminders that these gentle giants were not just reptiles but early members of the group that would eventually give rise to creatures that still fill our skies. As we continue our journey through the Jurassic world, keep in mind the presence of these magnificent creatures moving slowly and deliberately through their ancient realm, their long necks swaying against prehistoric skies, their footsteps marking time in a world that no longer exists, but that lives on in the fossil record, and in the imagination of anyone who has ever wondered what it would be like to stand in the shadow of the largest land animals that ever lived. But the sauropods, for all their magnificence, did not rule the Jurassic world alone. They shared their realm with predators that had evolved specifically to hunt in a world full of giants, and with other herbivores that had found different strategies for survival in ecosystems dominated by creatures of impossible size. The predators of the Jurassic were not just larger versions of modern carnivores. They were specialists, evolved over millions of years to hunt prey that presented challenges no modern predator has ever faced. How do you bring down an animal that weighs 50 tons and travels in protective herds? How do you compete for food in a world where the largest prey items are too big for any single predator to handle? The answer evolution discovered was to become specialists in different aspects of predation. Allosaurus and its relatives became the lions of the Jurassic world, powerful, adaptable hunters that could take medium-sized prey reliably, and occasionally, working together, bring down something much larger. They were built for power and persistence rather than speed, with bone-crushing jaws and razor-sharp claws that could inflict devastating wounds on even the largest herbivores. These predators didn't need to kill a giant sauropod outright. They just needed to wound it badly enough that infection and blood loss would do the rest. This strategy required patience, cunning, and the ability to track wounded prey over long distances. It also required social cooperation of a kind that may have been more sophisticated than we typically associate with reptiles. Smaller theropods filled different niches in this predatory landscape. Some were pursuit predators built for speed and agility, specializing in hunting the smaller herbivores that lived alongside the giants. Others were ambush predators, capable of explosive bursts of activity when prey came within range. Still others may have been scavengers primarily, following the herds and feeding on animals that died from disease, accident, or the attacks of larger predators. The herbivores that weren't giants had to develop their own strategies for survival in a world where being large was the most obvious path to safety. Stegosaurus and its relatives chose armor and weaponry, developing bony plates along their backs and vicious spikes on their tails that could deliver fatal wounds to any predator careless enough to attack from the wrong angle. These weapons weren't just for show. Fossil evidence shows that they were used regularly in life-or-death encounters. Predator bones have been found with puncture wounds that match the size and shape of stegosaur tail spikes. Stegosaur bones show evidence of predator attacks and the wounds that some individuals survived. The relationship between predator and prey in the Jurassic was not abstract or theoretical. It was written in blood and bone and the daily struggle for survival. Other herbivores chose different strategies. Some relied on speed and alertness, developing keen senses and the ability to flee quickly when danger threatened. Others lived in herds where many eyes could watch for predators and many legs could carry the group to safety. Still others, like the heavily armored ankylosaurs that would become more common in later periods, chose nearly impregnable defense as their path to survival. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jurassic predator-prey relationships was their complexity. This wasn't a simple system of hunters and hunted, but a web of interactions that connected species across multiple size scales and ecological niches. Large predators influenced the behavior of large herbivores, which in turn affected the plants they fed on, which influenced the smaller herbivores, which supported the smaller predators, in cycles that connected every level of the ecosystem. Seasonal changes added another layer of complexity to these relationships. During dry seasons, prey animals would concentrate around water sources, creating temporary abundance for predators, but also increasing competition between different carnivore species. During wet seasons, prey would spread out across the landscape, forcing predators to travel further and work harder for their meals. The effects of predation extended beyond the immediate relationship between hunter and hunted. Herbivores that had to constantly watch for predators fed differently than those that felt secure. They might avoid open areas where they could be easily seen, or they might feed in quick bursts rather than spending long periods with their heads down. This influenced which plants they ate and where, which in turn affected plant communities and the other animals that depended on them. Even the presence of large carcasses created its own ecosystem dynamics. A dead sauropod could feed scavengers for weeks, attracting predators from miles around and creating temporary communities of competing carnivores. The remains would eventually be cleaned up by insects, bacteria, and other decomposers, but the nutrients released into the soil would support plant growth for years afterward. The predators themselves faced their own challenges beyond finding food. They had to compete with each other for territory, mates, and resources. They had to avoid becoming prey themselves. Large predators were sometimes killed by their intended victims or by larger predators. They had to survive periods of scarcity when prey was unavailable, injuries that might cripple their hunting ability, and diseases that could spread through populations. Fossil evidence shows that life as a Jurassic predator was often harsh and dangerous. Bones with healed fractures tell of injuries survived through toughness and luck. Pathological bones show evidence of infections, arthritis, and other ailments that would have compromised hunting ability. Some fossils show signs of malnutrition during lean times, while others show evidence of the feast or famine lifestyle that characterized most large predators. Yet despite these challenges, predators were essential to the functioning of Jurassic ecosystems. They prevented herbivore populations from growing so large that they would destroy their food sources. They eliminated sick and weak individuals, improving the overall health of prey populations. They created carrion that supported scavengers and decomposers. They drove the evolution of defensive strategies in herbivores, contributing to the remarkable diversity of forms that characterized the period. The relationship between predator and prey in the Jurassic was not a war with winners and losers, but a dance that had been choreographed by millions of years of evolution. Each side pushed the other to greater levels of sophistication, creating an arms race that drove the development of larger size, better weapons, more effective defenses, and more complex behaviors. This dance was not performed on an empty stage, but in environments that were themselves dynamic and changing. Volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, and the ongoing breakup of continents created challenges and opportunities that both predators and prey had to navigate. Species that could adapt to changing conditions thrived, while those that were too specialized for particular environments risked extinction when conditions changed. The legacy of these Jurassic predator-prey relationships can still be seen in modern ecosystems, where the same basic patterns play out with different actors. Predators still shape the behavior and evolution of their prey. Herbivores still develop defenses against predation. Scavengers still clean up the remains, and the effects of predation still ripple through entire ecosystems. But the scale and intensity of these relationships during the Jurassic may never have been matched. In a world of giants, everything was amplified. The size of the prey, the power of the predators, the complexity of the interactions, and the effects on the environment. It was a world where the stakes of every predator-prey encounter were enormous, where survival often depended on split-second decisions, and where the balance between life and death shaped the very structure of terrestrial ecosystems. Understanding these relationships helps us appreciate not just the drama of life in the ancient world, but the intricate web of connections that made that world function. Every roar, every chase, every kill was part of a larger pattern that maintained the balance and diversity that made the Jurassic one of the most successful periods in Earth's history. As we near the end of our journey through this ancient world, it's worth pausing to consider what all of this means, not just as a collection of fascinating facts about the past, but as a window into the deeper patterns that connect all life across time. The Jurassic world we've explored together was not separate from your world. It was part of the same unbroken chain of life that leads directly to the present moment. The atoms in your body have been part of Jurassic creatures. The oxygen you breathe was exhaled by Jurassic plants. The very processes that keep you alive, metabolism, reproduction, growth, adaptation, are the same processes that powered life 200 million years ago. What makes the Jurassic so remarkable is not that it was different from today, but that it shows us possibilities we might never have imagined. Life finding ways to grow to impossible sizes, ecosystems supporting abundance on scales that challenge comprehension, evolution experimenting with forms so strange and wonderful that they seem like creatures from myth rather than real history. Yet they were real as anything in your world today. They lived and breathed and struggled and thrived in landscapes that were as vivid to them as your surroundings are to you. They felt hunger and satisfaction, fear and safety, the simple pleasures of sunlight on skin, and the complex satisfactions of raising young successfully in a dangerous world. The story of the Jurassic is ultimately a story about resilience, adaptation, and the incredible creativity of life itself. It shows us that life can flourish under conditions very different from today's, that evolution can find solutions to challenges we might think impossible, and that the natural world has depths of complexity and beauty that we are only beginning to understand. It also reminds us that change is the only constant in the history of life. The magnificent world of the Jurassic eventually gave way to other worlds, other experiments, other forms of abundance and beauty. The sauropods and marine reptiles and ancient forests all passed into extinction, but their legacy lives on in the genetic heritage of their descendants and in the ecological principles that continue to govern life on Earth. Perhaps most importantly, the Jurassic teaches us humility about our place in the grand sweep of time. Human civilization has existed for perhaps 10,000 years. Our species has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. The Jurassic lasted for almost 60 million years, 200 times longer than our entire species has existed. In the context of Earth's history, we are very new arrivals, the latest in a long line of experiments in consciousness and complexity. This perspective can be sobering, but it can also be liberating. It reminds us that we are part of something much larger than ourselves, participants in an ongoing story that began long before us and will continue long after us. Our brief moment in this story is precious not because it will last forever, but because it is our opportunity to add our own chapter to the great book of life. The Jurassic world shows us that Earth has been home to wonders beyond imagination, and that life has found ways to create beauty and complexity under conditions that might seem impossible. If life could flourish so magnificently in the warm seas and ancient forests of 200 million years ago, what other wonders might be possible in the millions of years to come? As you drift back toward your own time, carrying with you the images and sounds and smells of that ancient world, remember that you have touched something eternal, the continuing story of life on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in a galaxy full of possibilities. The Jurassic is not gone. It lives on in the birds outside your window, in the plants growing in every patch of soil, in the very air you breathe and the water that flows through your body. You are connected to that ancient world not just through abstract evolutionary relationships, but through the immediate physical reality of matter and energy that has been cycling through living systems for billions of years. You are literally made of stardust and ancient life, a temporary arrangement of atoms that once danced in Jurassic creatures and will someday dance in future beings we cannot even imagine. So as you settle into rest, as your thoughts grow quiet and your breathing deepens, know that you carry within yourself the heritage of deep time, the same forces that shaped the Jurassic world, growth, adaptation, the endless creativity of life, continue to work in you and through you. You are not separate from the natural world, but part of it, a continuation of the same story that began in ancient seas and ancient forests, and continues in your heartbeat, your dreams, and your capacity for wonder. The Jurassic waits for you always, patient as stone, magnificent as sunrise, ready to share its secrets with anyone who makes space for wonder. And in return, it asks only that you remember, you are part of the same story, the same experiment in consciousness and complexity, the same ongoing exploration of what life can become when it has time and space and the infinite patience of evolution to work its quiet miracles. Rest well, knowing that you have walked among giants, swum in ancient seas, and breathed the air of a world that existed so long ago that its very existence seems like a dream. But it was not a dream. It was real as you are now, as real as the love and wonder that connect you to everything that has ever lived, and everything that ever will live, in the endless eternal dance of life on Earth. Sleep peacefully, and let the gentle giants of the Jurassic carry you into dreams of deep time. But then, silence. Not a pause, not a breath between moments. A silence that pressed down on everything, thick and final. The kind of silence that fills a room after something irreversible. The kind that carries weight, like grief, like the end of a song with no encore. Ash still floated in the air, falling in slow motion, soft as snow, deadly as poison. The skies had gone dark, not in bursts, not in storms, but in a slow, creeping fade. Days passed where the sun barely rose, just a dull orange glow behind curtains of smoke. Nights were blacker than before. Time became hard to measure. Nothing bloomed, nothing sang. The forests, once cacophonous with insect buzz, bird-like chirps, and the distant rumble of footsteps, stood motionless. Trees wilted and fell, not to axes or flame, but to absence. Ferns curled into dry spirals. Vines lost their grip. The leaves didn't drop with the seasons. They crumbled in place. Moss turned grey. Spores found no home. Roots still clawed the soil, but even the soil had gone still. Where once the air was thick with scent, floral, fungal, loamy with life, now it smelled only of ash and decay, the aroma of endings, like a house long since abandoned, familiar but hollow. The dinosaurs, the rulers of this age, faded with it. They did not all fall in one day. There was no grand exodus, no final noble stand beneath the stars. There was hunger, then desperation, then confusion. The herds that once marched like mobile cities began to splinter. The old grew weaker, the young cried more often. Some called out to empty air, looking for the others, looking for the past. The ones who had once ruled, tyrants, horned giants, armored tanks, found themselves in a world that no longer listened to them. No one came to challenge the apex predators anymore. The ground no longer trembled under stampedes. The skies, once full of wings and screeches, were nearly silent. The pterosaurs fell first. Their wings were too wide, too fragile for a world without thermals, without sunlight, without prey. One by one they dropped from the sky, and where they landed, they stayed. And the oceans. The oceans were quiet in a way they had never been. Plankton, the microscopic engines of everything, vanished, and the sea, once alive with ancient monsters, became a graveyard of motionless forms. The great predators, with their teeth like sabers and bodies like torpedoes, simply stopped moving. Fish swam slower, then not at all. Coral reefs, once exploding with color, dulled to lifeless gray. Algae turned pale. Sand buried what was left. No explosions, no mass cries, just absence. The world for a time belonged to nothing. Clouds drifted without resistance. Winds howled across empty plains. Mountains, untouched by the chaos, looked down on what remained. If you stood there then, you might have thought this was the end of everything, that life had had its chance and failed. But deep beneath the soil, inside a burrow carved by instinct, not intelligence, something moved. Small, fragile, unimpressive. Not a survivor built by strength or speed, but by timing, by caution, by luck. A creature no larger than your hand stirred in the darkness. It sniffed the air, stale but breathable. Its tiny heart beat faster now, as warmth returned to its limbs. Its fur, coarse and patchy, bristled with each movement. It had survived, not by fighting, not by running, but by hiding, by waiting, by knowing when to go still. It had lived through a world of monsters, and now it crawled into a world of ghosts. It moved through roots and shadows, climbing over bones it could not name. The air was colder than before. The light was weaker, but the silence was softer now. Less final, more like a pause. It found something to eat, a sprouting fungus, a beetle, anything, and it ate without hesitation. That was its purpose now, to stay alive. There was no grand mission, no instinct to rebuild what had been lost, just the simple, relentless drive to wake up again the next day. And so it did. So did others. Tiny creatures, once insignificant, now found space to move. With the giants gone, there was room to breathe, room to grow, room to imagine, even if they didn't know it. Time, which had felt broken, began to stretch again. A season passed, or something like one. The ash began to settle. The sun fought through the dust with more persistence. Shadows returned to the ground. Plants, the few that had clung to life in some forgotten valley, began to stretch upward again, hesitantly, as if afraid to hope. Moss crept back across rock. Lichen etched silent patterns into bark. Ferns tried once more. And beneath them, the small things multiplied. Mammals, insects, early birds. Life began to experiment again, cautiously, quietly. There were no roars now, only the rustle of leaves, the crackle of underbrush, the quiet hum of survival. Millions of years passed. What rose from that silence wasn't bigger, it was smarter. Not smarter in the way we think of intelligence now, not yet, but smarter in decisions, in reaction, in adaptability. The world no longer belonged to titans, it belonged to those who knew how to change. The mammals diversified. Some took to the trees, some stayed hidden in the dark, some returned to the sea, their shapes stretched, their senses sharpened, their lives shortened or lengthened based on what the world needed. They were flexible in a way no dinosaur had ever been, and as they moved, the earth changed with them. The continents kept drifting. Mountains rose, oceans narrowed, new forests appeared, the air warmed, then cooled, ice crept across the land and receded again. Flowers bloomed for the first time, painting the earth in colors it had never seen before. Bees buzzed through new meadows, fruits appeared, grasses spread. Entirely new ecosystems formed, built not on brute force but on balance. There were still predators, still prey, still life and death and everything in between. But gone were the days of scaled behemoths. Gone were the walking cathedrals of muscle and bone. The age of size was over. Now came the age of nuance. And eventually, somewhere in a forest that no longer resembled anything Jurassic, one of those tiny creatures learned to use its paws to shape the world around it, not with claws, not with strength, but with purpose. A stick became a tool, a sound became a name, a spark became a fire. And from that, slowly, impossibly, came stories. They would not remember the names of the giants that had walked before them, but their bones would tell the tale. Their fossils would whisper through stone and time. And one day, someone would listen. Someone like you. You, sitting here now, hearing the echoes of a world long buried, imagining the creatures that once roamed, the trees that once towered, the skies that once darkened, not with ash but with wings. You're still part of that same story now. Because Earth didn't start with us. And it won't end with us. We are a page in a book already thousands of chapters deep, a single breath in a planet that has been breathing for billions of years. But somehow we get to read it, to write in it. And that, in the quiet after the end, might be the most miraculous thing of all. Life didn't bounce back. It crept, inches at a time. It started in cracks, in the bark of charred trees, in the folds of cooled lava, in the hollowed-out spaces where roots once ran deep. These were the pockets where warmth still lingered, where water still dripped, where shelter still existed if you knew how to find it. And something did. Many things, actually. Mammals, once small, once hunted, once hiding, began to rise. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but steadily. Their time had come not by conquest but by survival. While the skies were falling and the earth was shaking, they had gone underground, into hollows, into shadows, into silence. And now, with the thunder gone and the roar of the age of dinosaurs nothing but a whisper in the rocks, the small things emerged. They didn't look like anything special. Fur-covered, warm-blooded, eyes always scanning. Most of them no bigger than a modern-day rat. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in something new, versatility. They could live in cold, in dark, in high places, and low. Some could climb, others could burrow, some would begin to glide. In a world stripped bare, adaptability was the new crown. The mammals began to split, not in conflict, but in form. Evolution moved quickly in an empty world. With so many niches left vacant, nature rushed to fill them. One line grew teeth sharper and bodies longer, built for chasing what little prey remained. Another grew flatter, slower, thicker furred, for the cold mornings in the highlands. Some took to the trees, their paws learning to grip bark and balance on branches. Others returned to the waters, where the ancestors of whales and seals would begin their journey back into the blue. But always, always, they stayed small for now. The memory of ash lingered too deeply. Caution was still survival. The forests that returned were different. No longer the towering gymnosperm cathedrals of the Jurassic, but newer, stranger groves, flowering plants. Angiosperms took over. Petals unfolded where before only cones had grown. Colors flourished. Pollen danced. Insects adapted with them, drawn to the shapes and scents of a world painting itself anew. Bees appeared. Butterflies followed. Fruits evolved, not for beauty but for bribery. Sweetness became a deal with the animal kingdom. Eat me, carry my seeds. Life at every level began to trade, to cooperate, to gamble. And in this new deal, mammals thrived. Some grew eyes that could see in the dark. Some developed hands with opposable thumbs. Some began forming family groups, complex social bonds, warning calls, shared territories. Brains grew larger, not for processing raw power, but for understanding relationships, for storing memory, for imagining what might come next. One lineage, small and tree-bound, began to show something different. Primates. They weren't remarkable yet, but they moved through the world with a particular kind of awareness. Curious, watching, learning from each other. Their infants took longer to grow, a strange, dangerous trait, but it meant more time to teach, to model behavior, to pass down what worked. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, knowledge began to travel through time. The world continued its long arc of change. Continents drifted, mountains crumbled, volcanoes erupted and cooled, ice returned, then melted, and through it all, life didn't stop. It adapted, fractured, rebuilt, and then, somewhere, deep in the forests of what would one day be Africa, a hand reached out and picked up a rock. Not to eat, not to throw, but to use, to strike, to shape, to solve. And in that moment, however brief, however clumsy, something irreversible happened. Imagination met action. It would happen again and again, over hundreds of generations. One primate would watch another, see what they did, copy it, change it, improve it. Soon the rocks were sharper, the sticks more precise. Fire was no longer a mystery, but a tool. Shelter became more than a fallen log. It became intention, purpose, design. The earth, which had once shaped life without permission, now had life that shaped back. But it didn't stop there, because those same hands that shaped stone also began to shape sound. Grunts became calls, calls became symbols, symbols became language. Now the lessons didn't need to be watched. They could be told, described, imagined, passed on, across generations, across landscapes, across lifetimes. The stories began, and in those stories of where to find water, of what not to eat, of what happens when the sky grows strange, the ghosts of the Jurassic returned. Not by name, not as science, but as feeling. The deep, inherited fear of things in the dark, of thunder without lightning, of roars that never end. We told stories around fires about monsters and giants and beasts that shook the earth, and though we didn't know it at the time, we were remembering. The bones we would one day dig from the rocks were not just curiosities, they were echoes, evidence, proof that our oldest fears, and maybe our oldest awe, came from something real. And so we started asking questions. What came before us? How did we get here? Why are the rocks so old? Why does this mountain look like an ancient wave frozen in time? And eventually, someone found a fossil. Stone shaped like bone, patterns etched in mud now hardened into memory, teeth too large to be anything living, leaves imprinted in shale, a claw, a shell, a spine. At first we didn't know what they were. Dragons, we said, serpents, gods, punishments. Then slowly, across centuries, we began to piece it together. One fossil became 2, then 10, then hundreds. Across deserts and cliffs and ancient riverbeds, we dug, we studied, we connected. We realized that life had not always been like this, that the earth had once been home to creatures we couldn't even imagine. That time was not short, but deep. That extinction wasn't fiction, but history, and that we were part of it. The age of dinosaurs became more than myth. It became science. But even now, even with everything we know, something in us doesn't just want facts, we want feeling. We want to know what it sounded like when a herd of Diplodocus crossed a plain. We want to know what a pterosaur saw from the sky. We want to stand in the shadow of a tyrannosaur, not because we're curious, but because we want to feel small again. We want to remember what the world was like before we named it. That's what story does. It brings the past back to life, not just as knowledge but as experience. And when we imagine the Jurassic, the towering trees, The buzzing humidity, the thunder of footsteps on soft ground. We're not just dreaming. We sit listening. Because the earth remembers, the rocks remember, and if we're quiet enough, we can too. The earth holds memories. Not in journals, not in paintings, but in stone. Layer upon layer, pressed by time, marked by heat, cracked by frost. Every cliff face, every canyon wall, every seabed lifted into mountain. A library, a record of what once was, left for anyone patient enough to read it. For most of human history we didn't know this. We walked on fossils, built homes from sediment filled with ancient shells, painted inside caves carved by water that once flowed through Jurassic rivers. We slept above the bones of titans. But we didn't understand. We saw strange shapes in rock, spirals, patterns, imprints, and made stories for them. Sea serpents, thunder beasts, gods turned to stone. The imagination filled in what science had not yet reached. And in a way, it wasn't wrong, because the truth was just as magical. Somewhere not long ago in the sweep of time, someone found a bone where no living creature could have placed it. It wasn't just old, it was impossible, too large, too deep, too strange. And so began the digging. Not as treasure hunters, not at first, but as witnesses, curious minds with calloused hands and aching backs, pulling secrets from the dust. At first we didn't even know what we were looking for. A femur the size of a tree trunk, a tooth longer than a hand, a skull that didn't match anything walking the earth. We gave them names drawn from myths. Terrible lizards, stone dragons. We saw monsters where there had once been animals. But then something shifted. We started seeing the pattern. One fossil led to another. A foot, then a tail, a rib cage, a jaw, entire skeletons, still curved in sleep after 100 million years. It wasn't chaos, it was story. Preserved in the mud, the puzzle wasn't just finding the pieces, it was imagining the world they once fit into. That's where paleontology was born, not just from discovery but from empathy. Because to look at a fossil and see more than just a rock, to see a creature, a moment, a life requires imagination. It means being able to stand in the shadow of bones and see skin, movement, breath. It means asking questions. What did it eat? Where did it sleep? Was it alone? Did it raise young? Did it fear? Did it fight? Did it remember? We stopped looking at fossils as trophies and started seeing them as messages, not from one animal but from entire worlds. And the earth began to open up. In China, fossilized nests with perfect rings of eggs revealed the tender side of creatures once thought monstrous. In Argentina, the femurs of sauropods hinted at beasts the length of basketball courts. In Mongolia, two dinosaurs locked in mid-combat, predator and prey, frozen in time, caught in their final moment. The rocks weren't set just old, they were precise. Footprints told of migration. Coprolites, fossilized dung revealed diets. Amber captured insects in mid-wing, pollen on their legs. Even raindrops. We found fossils with stomach content still intact, others with soft tissue, skin impressions, feathers, entire ancient forests petrified in place, their trunks still rooted, their rings still counting seasons long vanished. Every dig site became a time capsule, every fossil a window. And with each new discovery, the image of the Jurassic sharpened. It wasn't just a world of giants. It was a web, a system, delicate, interconnected, massive and intimate all at once. Dinosaurs weren't mindless beasts. They had communities, territories, courtship rituals. Some sang, some danced, some raised their young with care, others nested in colonies. They weren't just surviving, they were living. And the more we learned, the more we saw ourselves in them. We began to animate them. Not in stories, but in science. We built skeletons in museums, towering over children staring upward in silent awe. We scanned fossils with X-rays, 3D printed bones, simulated muscles, ligaments, skin. We recreated their calls. Low, resonant vibrations like nothing alive today. We mapped their environments, simulated their movements. We made them walk again, in pixels, in models, in our minds. And maybe most profoundly, we started to feel something for them. Not fear, not just curiosity, but something deeper. Grief. Because we knew how it ended. All of it. No matter how large, how fast, how perfect, everything in the Jurassic died, wiped clean in one cataclysm, an entire era turned to stone. And yet, not forgotten. Because we remembered, through excavation, through study, through story. Because something in us needs to understand what came before, not just for science, not just for knowledge, but for perspective. To know that we are not the first, that Earth has seen ages of wonder, that extinction is not fiction, that time is not ours, that we store visitors. Brief, fragile, lucky, and to understand that fully, we dig. We kneel in dirt with brushes and tweezers, whispering to the dead, not because we expect answers, but because we believe that listening matters. The earth will not speak loudly, but it remembers. And if you sit quiet, if you sit patient, it will tell you everything. We tend to think of extinction as the end of the story, a final breath, a last page. But on Earth, extinction is a chapter, not a conclusion. There have been 5 mass extinctions, not including the one we are living through now. The end of the dinosaurs was just the 5th, the most famous but not the first. Before them, entire kingdoms of life had come and gone. The oceans have died before. The skies have gone still before. There were times when 90% of all life vanished. Not just one lineage, not just one branch, almost everything. Gone. And still, life came back. Changed, scarred, but alive. Because Earth doesn't cling to any one form. It experiments, it lets go, it starts again. That sips what deep time really means. It's not just long, it's vast, indifferent, patient in ways we can't comprehend. It doesn't count days. It measures in extinctions, in ice ages, in the slow rise and fall of continents, in the way mountains fold into plains and oceans, swallow them whole again. We as a species have existed for the blink of an eye in that timeline. If the entire history of Earth was compressed into a single calendar year, dinosaurs went extinct on December 26. Modern humans? We showed up just before midnight on December 31st. Everything we know, all of civilization, language, culture, agriculture, cities, fits in the final few seconds of that year. And yet, we act like it's always been this way. We walk on ancient ground thinking it's new. We build towers and call them permanent. We look at the stars and think the story began with us. But the Earth knows better. It remembers. It remembers the silence after the Permian extinction, when 95% of marine species disappeared. It remembers the Great Oxygenation Event, when microbes poisoned the air for almost everything else. It remembers asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, continents ripped apart and slammed back together. It remembers loss. And it remembers recovery. Because life is not delicate. It is stubborn. It adapts. It crawls back from the edge again and again, but never in the same form. That sips the cost. That sips the pattern. Nothing comes back the same. Dinosaurs didn't return after the asteroid, but birds came from them. A shadow, a song, a reminder. The ammonites never reappeared, but their spirals echo in every snail, every chambered shell. Mammals didn't outcompete dinosaurs, they outlasted them. Because the game isn't about domination, it's about endurance. And now, here we are, the ones with memory, with tools, with language, with the ability to look back millions of years and see ourselves. And is it changing the Earth again, faster than ever before, faster than the asteroid, faster than volcanoes, faster than any force this planet has seen? We're not just reshaping landscapes, we're triggering another extinction, not someday, not hypothetically. Now, species are vanishing before we name them, habitats are collapsing, coral reefs, rainforests, ice sheets unraveling. And it's set not because we set are evil or careless. It's because we've forgotten the scale of time we exist within. We act like passengers, tourists, as if we're visiting this world, not part of it. But we are Earth. We are stardust that learned to observe itself. We are atoms that remember, cells that cooperate. A brief, bright flicker of consciousness in a universe that doesn't need it, but got it anyway. That is sacred and fragile. So when we dig into the past, when we unearth the bones of things that came before, we're not just studying them. We're said being warned. Every extinction carries a message, a lesson in hubris, a note from the past to the present. Nothing is immune. No species is guaranteed. No reign is permanent. But that sep's not a reason for fear. It sep's a reason to listen. Because knowing the story, knowing how often the page has turned, doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat it. It means we have a choice. We are the first species to witness the arc of life and death across eons and still have time to decide what comes next. We are not separate from extinction. We are its children. But maybe, just maybe, we don't have to be its next chapter. There is something sacred about imagining the past, not just remembering, but rebuilding, reconstructing what no eye has seen, no breath has touched. For tens of millions of years, we weren't there. No human walked beside a dinosaur. No language echoed through the jungles of the Jurassic. No fire crackled beneath a canopy of conifers while a brachiosaur raised its head above the trees. And yet, we try. We draw them. We sculpt them. We animate them. We dream of them. We take the cold certainty of bone and fill it with muscle, skin, movement, intention. We wonder about their colors, their sounds, how they moved when they were relaxed, what it felt like to sleep beneath stars millions of years older than any human gaze. And what makes this beautiful is that we don't need to. There's no economic gain in reconstructing a stegosaur's tail motion, no survival benefit in recreating the call of a pterosaur, no urgent need to figure out how a triceratops might have cared for its young. But we do it anyway, because there's something deeply human about wanting to know what came before, not just as data, but as experience. It's not enough for us to know that a creature existed. We want to stand beside it, even if only in our minds, to feel its presence, to imagine the weight of its footsteps, the warmth of its breath, the way the wind might have rippled through its feathers or the forest around it. We are a species of storytellers, of dreamers, and in every fossil we uncover, we see more than what is. We see what was. And sometimes, if we're lucky, what it meant. That's why museums matter, not just because they house skeletons, but because they give people a place to feel time. To walk beneath a mounted sauropod is to be reminded of scale, of duration, of humility. To see the claw of a dromaeosaur suspended in glass is to understand that not all power roars, some of it whispers. And to look into the reconstructed skull of a tyrannosaur, teeth bared in eternal silence, is to meet the past eye to eye. We give them names. Latin words, sometimes poetic, sometimes clinical. But those names become anchors. Anchors for children, for scientists, for artists, for anyone who has ever looked at a shadow and wondered who cast it. Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, Compsognathus, Pteranodon. Each name, a doorway. Each skeleton, a memory made visible. And yet, for all our reconstructions, all our paintings and CGI in museum halls, there's something we'll never truly grasp. How it felt. Not just what it looked like, but what it was. What it was to be alive in a world untouched by cities, by satellites, by roads and engines, a world ruled by instinct, by the slow rhythm of day and night, by the song of insects and the deep murmur of ancient seas. Imagine standing in that world. The sun rising over a warm misted valley, the air thick with unfamiliar scents, resin, damp moss, something musky on the breeze. You hear movement, deep and distant, a groan of weight against earth. Leaves rustle high above, not from wind but from something brushing past, unseen. You don't speak. There sits no one to speak to. You are alone in a world that does not care you exist. And in that stillness, awe, not fear, not exactly, something deeper. You realize how new you are, how temporary, and how much came before. The dinosaurs are not here to entertain us. They didn't evolve to fascinate us. They weren't waiting to be discovered. And yet, here we are, trying to see them clearly. And perhaps that sips the point. We build them back into being not because we must, but because it's how we make meaning of the infinite. Because the past is the one place we can never return to. And so we visit it in the only way we can, through stories, through science, through silence. A fossil is a fact. But imagining the creature it came from, the life it lived, is an act of empathy. We're not just scientists. We're mourners, archaeologists of wonder, architects of lost time. And every time we rebuild a dinosaur, every time we give it a shape, a sound, a motion, we're not just reviving a creature. We're reminding ourselves that the Earth was not made for us, that it will go on without us. But for this one moment, this one brief flicker of awareness, we get to remember what came before. Not as ghosts, but as giants. The dinosaurs didn't just exist. They belonged, not to cages or museums or movies, but to a world that looked nothing like ours. To walk through the Jurassic wasn't just to see new animals, it was to be on a different planet. The continents were still in motion, slow, grinding tectonic dreams drifting across molten currents. Pangaea, the supercontinent that had once welded everything into one, had started to crack. Fractures became rifts, oceans widened, land masses pulled apart like soft dough on a baking stone. And with that shift came change. Climate, rainfall, wind, currents, all of it stirred by the breaking of Earth's shell. Where deserts had once ruled, now there were humid coastal forests. New seas sliced into old lands, bringing moisture to places that had been dry for millions of years. Mountains rose like wrinkles on the surface of time. Volcanoes spat ash into the sky, feeding the soil below even as they blotted out the sun. This was not a world standing still. It breathed. And life, as always, adapted. The forests of the Jurassic were not green in the way we know green. There were no grasses underfoot, no flowering trees, no fruits or blossoms. These had not evolved yet. Instead, ferns. Everywhere, ferns as tall as men, mosses in carpets thick enough to muffle footsteps, towering conifers reached into the mist, their bark oozing amber that would trap insects for 150 million years. Beneath them, cycads with armored fronds, ginkgos with delicate fans, and horsetails like feathered spears rising from wetlands. It was a landscape sculpted by time, untouched by footprints shaped like ours. And moving through this world, the animals. Dinosaurs were not alone. There were insects, some familiar, some alien. Giant dragonflies skimmed the surface of still lakes. Beetles carved patterns through bark that fossilized into time capsules of behavior. There were amphibians, bloated and strange, clinging to murky edges. There were early mammals, soft, warm, hidden in roots and shadows, emerging only when the giants passed. There were fish, armored and agile, darting through shallow seas rich with plankton and the slow roll of ancient tides. And above it all, the skies. This was the age when the heavens were no longer empty. Pterosaurs ruled the air, not birds. Their wingspans ranged from the size of a raven to the size of a small airplane. Some soared on thermal winds. Others flapped awkwardly between cliffs. Their bones were hollow, their heads often crested. Aerodynamic sculptures evolved to ride the breath of the world itself. They nested on cliffs, in trees, maybe even cooperatively in colonies. We don't know, but we've found their footprints. And that means they walked the earth just like anything else, not just as shadows in the sky, but as neighbors to the dinosaurs below. And the dinosaurs, they weren't set all titans. For every brachiosaur there were dozens of smaller creatures, quick-footed scavengers, feathery omnivores, horned browsers, armored herbivores. This was not a world of monsters. It was a world of balance, predator and prey, night and day, flood and drought. Ecosystems didn't just exist. They worked, and that sits the part we often forget. The Jurassic wasn't a stage set for giants. It was a living system, vast and intricate. Rivers carried nutrients through valleys. Volcanoes fertilized forests. Storms cleared decay. Insects pollinated cycads. Crops didn't need planting. Balance wasn't managed. It emerged. Each species had its place, not by design, not by dominance, but by need. A sauropod eats hundreds of pounds of foliage. It clears space for new growth. A predator hunts the old, the slow. It strengthens the herd. A scavenger cleans what's left. Nothing wasted. Nothing truly dies alone in an ecosystem like this. Even decay was alive. Bacteria breaking down the fallen, feeding the soil, restarting the cycle. And all of it, every root, every wing beat, every ripple, was part of the same whole. When we imagine dinosaurs, we tend to isolate them. A T-Rex in a field, a raptor in a corridor, but they didn't live in isolation. They lived in worlds. Dynamic, chaotic, ordered, interdependent. To imagine a single dinosaur is to imagine an entire ecosystem. The rainfall that fed the forest it walked through, the insects that burrowed in the bark it passed, the distant volcano whose ash colored the sunset it never understood. And through it all, the sky kept changing. Not just the position of the stars, but the atmosphere itself. The Jurassic had more oxygen, more carbon dioxide. Temperatures were warmer, sea levels were higher. The air smelled different, sound carried differently. The winds were older, unfiltered by cityscape or smokestack. It wasn't set better or worse, just different. Alien, familiar only in glimpses, in the curve of a fern, the hiss of a breeze through pine, the silhouette of a lizard at dusk. The past is not a version of us. It sits its own story. And the Jurassic was one of Earth's strangest, most beautiful chapters. One we'll never truly walk through, but one we can remember. Not because it sits ours, but because it came before. Extinction has always been a part of life. It is nature's reset button, brutal, indifferent, final. A storm that clears the stage, even if the play wasn't finished. For most of Earth's history, extinction came from forces beyond control. Asteroids, supervolcanoes, global freezing, oxygen shifts, collapsing food webs caused by things no creature could predict or prevent. But this time, it sits different. This time, it sips us. Species are vanishing, not because the Earth has turned on them, but because we have. The forests that once cradled generations are falling to fire and steel. The oceans are warming faster than coral can adapt. Plastics swirl in gyres where plankton should bloom. Ice is melting in places we thought eternal. It sats not one event. It sats a slow unraveling. like the earth is quietly bleeding out while we argue over the color of the bandage. This isn't the extinction of giants, it's the extinction of silence, of diversity, of resilience. We're losing not just species, we're losing options, solutions, relationships we never knew existed between things we never bothered to name. And all of it, so quiet. There are no screams when a frog goes extinct, no headlines when a tree never germinates again, no music when the last of something dies alone, unrecorded in a place no one visits. Extinction is not loud. It is the absence of sound where sound used to be. And the weight of it is hard to carry, because what do you do when you realize the asteroid is you? You grieve. You deny. You look away. But some look closer. Some dig in. Ask harder questions. Refuse to let the silence go unanswered. And from that comes something powerful. Not guilt, not despair. Responsibility. Because if we are the cause, we can also be the interruption. We can redraw the arc, slow the fall, buy time for the stories still being written. We are not helpless. We can restore wetlands, rebuild coral, reintroduce species, protect old-growth forests. We can listen to indigenous knowledge, fund science, teach the next generation not to look away. And we can remember, because memory is resistance. Every creature we bring back from the brink is a refusal to forget. Every protected forest is a decision to choose life. Every time we imagine a world not just surviving, but thriving, we are writing a different ending. Extinction may be inevitable, but participation is not. And maybe, just maybe, the lesson of the Jurassic isn't that life ends. It sets that life comes back, but only if something survives. And that something could be us. Not just humans, breathing and building, but humans remembering, humans preserving the music of the world before it fades. Not because we can save everything, but because we shouldn't let it go without trying. We are not separate from extinction. We stir part of the system now, and that means we're part of the solution or the silence. So the question is no longer will the Earth recover? It will. The question is, what will we leave behind? What will be our fossils? Will it be oil and plastic and concrete? Or will it be records of the ones we tried to save? What will they say about us? That we watched it burn? Or that we learned to plant again in the ashes? Because that is still up to us. After everything, something always survives. That sips the rule the Earth keeps repeating. Even in its darkest hours, after fire, flood, ash and ice, something finds a way forward. It might not be what came before. It might not be grand or loud or beautiful by any old definition. But it survives. And that survival, quiet, determined, unseen, becomes the beginning of something new. That sips what life does. It remembers how to begin again. Not in defiance of the past, but shaped by it. The first creatures to emerge after the mass extinction didn't inherit the world. They rebuilt it. Step by step, breath by breath. One adaptation at a time. Tiny roots split cracked rock. Spores found their way into cooling soil. Tiny mammals nursed their young in silence, listening for dangers that no longer came. There was no applause, no grand reveal. Just a planet, breathing again, and life, continuing the only way it knows how, by trying. And this matters more than it seems, because it reminds us that strength isn't always visible. Sometimes strength is persistence. Sometimes it's adaptation. Sometimes it's knowing how to bend before you break. The dinosaurs did instead fail. They lived for over 160 million years. Longer than any mammal, longer than any primate, longer than us. They adapted through continent shifts, sea level changes, atmospheric transformations, and climate extremes. They were not fragile, they were not simple, they were not doomed. They just ran out of time. And yet, some part of them is still here. The birds outside your window, the ones we take for granted, are not just descendants. They are survivors of the deepest test life can face. They are the answer to the question, what made it through? Feathers made it through. Warm-blooded metabolism made it through. Care for offspring, social structure, migration, song, all of it survived. Not by accident, but because it worked. It wasn't set, just power that got passed down. It was cooperation, communication, adaptability, traits that last. And now we set the ones carrying that thread. We too are the result of a million quiet victories, of creatures who survived not because they conquered, but because they endured. Every human being is a living fossil, in a way, a collection of traits that were tested by fire and time, selected not just by chance but by consequence. You have a spine that echoes fish. You breathe through lungs that evolved from ancient swim bladders. Your hearing is shaped by the same bones that once formed the jaw of reptiles. Your brain, that vast cathedral of imagination, was carved out by time, pressure, and need. You are made of Earth-Sept's memory, and when you imagine a dinosaur, when you dream of a world you never saw, that's not fantasy. That's Sept's remembering. It's remembering in the only way we can, through empathy, through creativity, through story, because story is what survives when time erases everything else. The rocks forget, the forests fall, the bones turn to dust, but the story moves forward. And maybe that's what all this is. Maybe looking back isn't just nostalgia. Maybe it's a way of keeping the line unbroken. Maybe imagining the Jurassic in detail, in emotion, in sound and scent and movement is how we say, I remember you, not because we knew them, but because we carry them in our biology, in our history, in our art, in our awe. What survives is not always what you expect, but it sits never meaningless. And in that truth, that small, quiet miracle, there is hope. Because if something always survives, then so can we. There's a strange peace that comes from looking backward. It doesn't change the world you live in. It doesn't fix what sits broken. But it gives you something rare in human life. Perspective. The kind of perspective you can only get from knowing how old the Earth really is. From knowing how many things have come and gone before you. From holding a fossil in your hand and realizing this was once alive, this mattered. It ate, it breathed, it feared, it ran, it had a heartbeat, a mate, a territory, a death, and now it sips stone. Stone that outlasted empires, stone that sat in silence while entire species rose and vanished above it, stone that now, somehow, is in your hands. What do you do with that? Some people feel sadness, a kind of grief, the weight of knowing that nothing lasts. Others feel awe, the wild, dizzying rush of realizing how small we are and how beautiful that is. But the best feeling, the rarest, and maybe the truest, is clarity. Clarity that life is not guaranteed, that nothing is permanent, and that this moment, this single breath you're taking right now, is part of a chain billions of years long. You are here. You are here now. Not by accident, not by destiny, but by survival, by inheritance, by chance and choice and time, all crashing together like waves until you happened. And that matters, because when you know how rare it is to be alive, when you really feel it, you start to see the world differently. The forest isn't just green, it sits ancient. The sky isn't just blue, it's the same sky the pterosaurs once soared through. The wind against your skin has touched more things than you'll ever understand. And suddenly, you sit not just living, you sit listening. You sit paying attention to the way leaves move, to the way light falls on old stone, to the stories hidden in the dirt beneath your feet. You start to treat the earth with more reverence, not because you're told to, but because you can feel the depth of it. You walk slower, you breathe deeper, you notice things, because now you know. You know that every ecosystem is the result of millions of years of collaboration. That every species, no matter how small, is here because it solved a problem we'll never understand. That life isn't just miraculous. It sits fragile. It took the Earth 4.5 billion years to get here. Let that sink in. Everything you've ever known, every book, every building, every language, every map, all of it happened in a fraction of time so small it barely registers on the geological scale. We are recent, and yet we're also aware. The trilobites didn't know they were disappearing. The ammonites didn't write poems before they vanished. But we can see what sips coming. We can imagine different outcomes. We can remember. And that changes everything. Perspective isn't just a feeling. It sets a responsibility. It's what we do now that decides whether we're another layer in the rock or something more. Not permanent, but meaningful. A species that remembered, a species that chose to listen, to protect, to imagine not just what was, but what could be. The dinosaurs didn't get that chance. But somehow we do. The story never really ends. It just folds into silence. And if you listen closely, sometimes you can still hear it breathing. A low hum beneath the static of everyday life. A pulse under your feet, where the roots dig into ancient stone. A flicker in the corner of your mind when you see a bird take flight and feel, without knowing why, that something old just moved through the air. Because the truth is, we were never alone. Not really. We've shared this planet with creatures we can't even imagine. Things with skin like stone, eyes like mirrors, hearts that beat beneath scales the size of leaves. And while most of them are gone now, they left something behind. Not just bones, but presence. Their shape is carved into the cliffs. Their movement is echoed in every shadow that passes through tall grass. Their memory rides on the back of every bird tucked between feathers like folded maps. And us? We stir not the destination. We are a continuation. We are not the Earth's final chapter. We're just one of its voices, briefly singing in a choir that started long before us and will continue long after we're gone. But what a voice we have. What a miracle to know the past, to imagine it, to learn from it, to love it, because that seps what this is, in the end. This entire journey, from impact to imagination, from fossils to firelight, has been an act of love, of remembering, of saying, I know you were here. We turned stone into story. We have taken silence and made music. We've made maps of time and dared to follow them. And maybe the most extraordinary part of all, we've looked into the abyss of extinction and found meaning. Not despair, not hopelessness, but perspective. And more than that, beauty. Because for every creature that vanished, something was born. For every extinction, a new expression of life took its place. The asteroid didn't end everything. It cleared space for something unexpected. It made room for feathers, for warmth, for language, for laughter, for memory, for us. And with that gift comes something no other species has ever had. Choice. We can decide how we tell this story. We can decide what we carry forward, what we protect, what we let go, what we honor. We are not rewriting the past, but we are writing the future. And it's worth asking, what kind of ancestor do we want to be? When future beings, human or otherwise, dig into the soil and uncover the fossils of our time, what will they see? Will they find the story of a species that forgot where it came from? Or one that remembered? Will they see layers of plastic and broken systems? Or pockets of resistance, forests regrown, species restored, children still imagining what dinosaurs might have sounded like. Because here sits the secret no textbook can teach. What we choose to remember becomes real, not in the scientific sense, but in the emotional one, the mythic one, the human one. Memory gives weight to silence. It turns absence into presence. It makes the past something we can carry. And that is everything. Because maybe the dinosaurs didn't die in vain. Maybe their bones beneath our museums, their shapes in our minds, their whispers in our DNA, maybe those are seeds. Seeds of humility, of wonder, of care. Maybe they've been waiting, not to be resurrected, not to be replicated, but to be heard. Maybe we were meant to listen. To the earth, to time, to everything that came before. Not to escape the present, but to understand it. Because here sits the truth you feel, even if no one says it. This world is sacred, not because of us, but because of its age, its complexity, its resilience. And once you feel that, really feel it, it becomes impossible to live the same way. You start to notice the way light touches old stone, the way birds tilt their heads as if remembering something, the way a single fossil held in your hand can collapse time into silence. It's not about knowing every species, every date, every mass extinction. It's about remembering that you are not separate from it. You're not an observer. You're part of it. You are a continuation of the same experiment that began in the sea, crawled onto land, took to the sky, and eventually sat down by a fire to tell a story. That story is still being told. And now it sits your turn to speak, not with answers, but with awe, with questions, with presence, with a willingness to remember what came before and to imagine what could still come after. You don't need to be a scientist to be part of this. You don't need to name the fossils. You just need to care, to notice, to wonder, to carry something forward. Even if that something is just a single idea, that life always finds a way. And when it does, it's worth listening to. Because that sound, the breath of a bird, the rustle of a fern, the slow rumble of thunder over ancient ground, that's not just the world being alive. That sips the world remembering. And when we remember with it, we are home,